Welcome to Nordic Magic Link, the podcast rooted in Nordic shamanism, where we also discover other spiritual practices rooted in nature. And we look to our ancestral backgrounds to find forgotten practices. Welcome to Nordic Magic Link. Today I am talking to Asger Folmann. Asger Folmann is a Danish-American actor, author, and songwriter known for his quirky roles, notably as Bandy in the highly anticipated fantasy feature classic Heavenquest, A Pilgrim's Progress. He is also a YouTuber. He has the popular YouTube channel called In It For The Money, about cryptocurrencies. He might be changing that pretty soon. We can talk about that maybe at the end. But today we are talking about the Vikings, their history, and in general the pre-Christian history of the Scandinavian countries. Right. Welcome, Asger.
Thank you very much.
And also, you are my husband.
Right. Yeah, I was hoping to introduce a little outrage here, groping you before people knew about that little detail.
So the reason why I'm talking to you about this is because you have a little bit of a background within this. Can you tell me, elaborate a little bit about your background?
I'll try and keep it brief. So I have some academic background, and I have some more, more normal, just an interest in the era and in the past, specifically the pre-Christian past. So, first of all, I used to study prehistoric archaeology. I almost hold a bachelor's degree in prehistoric archaeology, but it was too much about the physical remains of our ancestors and too little about the humans. And at the end of the day, I'm interested in humans, right? I think most people are. And it was almost like a taboo kind of thing. Don't speculate here. I mean, the professors can speculate. They could come up with all these fantastic stories, completely just like put them out of their behinds, right? About, oh yes, but they had this cult and they believed in this and that. But I'm like, yeah, but you don't really have any evidence for that. Or maybe you do have circumstantial evidence, but they were allowed to speculate and I wasn't, and that's one of the main reasons probably why I dropped out. So there's that, and I also did medieval reenactment, which is obviously slightly later, about 300 years to 200 years after the end of the Viking age, the official ending, whatever that means. So I did that for, I guess, 7 or 8 years, maybe, typically spending the summers touring Europe, mainly Denmark, sometimes Sweden, sometimes Germany. And during the winter time, we would basically prepare for this, prepare gear. We would pretty much make our own armor and buy some of the weapons from Czech Republic or Germany. And
for those who don't know what reenactment is, can you describe it?
So reenactment is basically a bunch of people getting together and in a as accurate as possible setting for a specific time period. It doesn't really have anything to do with if you live in the US and you're listening to this or watching this, and if you've been to the Renaissance Fair, it has very little resemblance to that, but there are some common denominators, basically. So it's the same concept of all these people come here. There might be a blacksmith, baker, different professions. And then, of course, there are the warriors and the knights and the nobility and all that stuff. And, of course, it's a little different. The further back you go, the less organized and the less medieval it becomes. Of course, we can get into that a little later.
Is there like a script that you're following, or is it just
not a script
playing?
Per se, but there would typically be maybe 2 or 3 combat shows each day, and I would take part in those.
So you were a warrior?
I was a warrior, yeah, a soldier,
Okay.
One of the king's soldiers, basically.
Okay.
So that was a big thing. We did some of the shows we did were very small, and of course, like in the daytime, we would have a constant flow of tourists coming in. But the real magic really begun. That's what got me hooked on this. as soon as it's 5 o'clock, we're closing down for the tourists. They're all leaving now, because everyone would stay in character. No modern artifacts. That's probably not the right word. It is the right word, but it might be a little misleading. No phones, nothing modern. You weren't even allowed if you had any. I had a nose piercing at a time. I remember I had to take it out.
Like me?
Yes, just like you. And just no modern things at all. You couldn't sing. I know that there were a couple people who used to tease one of the other reenactors. They would always sing "Yellow Submarine" by the Beatles, and they would get stuck in his mind, and he would go da da da. But no, I can't do that. Right? Damn it, it's modern, right? So that's just an example. But we would dance and sing. We would typically have bards there or musicians who really lived and breathed medieval.
So they
music.
knew the songs.
They knew all the songs, and someone would know the traditional. What are they called in English? It's called
ballads.
No. Oh yeah. I'm not talking about the music, but the dance that goes. There's a certain dance that goes along with it, which was huge in medieval Europe.
Did you also know that dance?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
It's fairly simple, but,
okay.
And it's everybody's sort of linked up to each other, and then you go along with it as long as you can, but people drop out eventually because it's quite exhausting and stupid.
Because you're spinning, or
no, you're not spinning per se. You're more like a huge human chain of people, and whoever leads this chain can pretty much take the whole chain through thorns and shrubberies or water even, and it's very silly, highly entertaining, but it was just fascinating, this whole being completely disconnected from everything modern. That was the real attraction. And I remember, I think I told you this anecdote before, but I remember one summer where I did 3 or 4 markets back to back, and I finally went into the train somewhere in Hamburg or whatever, and we arrived at the train station in our hometown, which is everything's relative from American standards. A very small town, but a relatively big town, a real city at least. And I remember just walking out on the street, and a car passed me, and I just intuitively jumped back. I was like, "Oh God, I'm back in civilization."
Wow.
Now. That was crazy.
Is there anything like that in the U.S.?
I believe there are a few private organizations sort of like that. I'm not. Well, actually, there is. I think we stumbled on. We went to a Scandinavian fair a couple times, once a year, out in Thousand Oaks.
Right, but that's not.
No, the fair itself.
Right?
No, the fair itself is not. But there is a Viking group there.
And they do these.
I'm pretty sure that they would fall under reenactment, because everything they had looked historically accurate to me.
Right. Okay.
Right. So I'm sure people could find a local group somewhere.
Okay. Very cool. Right. So, tell me, how did the Scandinavians live in Viking days and also earlier, and what did a typical day look like for them?
So it's a really good question, and of course it is a little harder to answer that question than it is for other periods, and the main reason is that even though they had a runic alphabet, it wasn't used to write down stuff in the same way the Romans did it, or even the Church, the Catholic Church, did it back then. So while people further south would write down long histories and even 1,000 years prior to the Viking Age, right, in around year 0, the Romans would write down, have little diaries and stuff. We don't have any of that.
Right. So, we do have some monks that wrote down.
We do have monks that wrote down, but I think the most prominent example could be Lindisfarne, which was a monastery in the UK that was attacked. I don't remember the exact year, I remember 842 or something along those lines. But so some of the other monasteries would write down accounts of this horrible attack and stuff. But it is, I think it's fair to say that it's fairly biased, the stuff they wrote down. That's allegedly also where the myth about Vikings having horns in their helmets come from. Like sometimes it was even said they have horns in their forehead, right? So it's more like a devil metaphor, sort of. But it's true. We do have like a very few written accounts of. There's an Arab merchant, Ibn al something. He met some Vikings on Riga, I believe. It's a very large river that runs through Russia and all the way through Poland and Germany, I believe. So that and it's pretty much an established fact that was used as a trade route for Vikings. They would export goods over there, sometimes go plunder and pillage as well, I guess. But he wrote down an account of a chieftain dying, and he would be burnt on his ship. And one of his slaves, or thralls as they were called, a female thrall, was sacrificed along with him after having sex with all the king's men. So there are some.
Why?
It was clearly, according to this eyewitness, it's like an eyewitness account. He just wrote down, "Oh, I just saw this," right? So it was clearly part of a ritual. It's actually, I believe, a small part of the movie called The 13th Warrior with Antonio Banderas. I believe that scene, there's a scene that's actually sort of inspired by that account, which is written down around year 1000 or so.
Was it terrifying to the man who wrote it down?
He considered it barbaric, definitely, yeah.
And the slave was probably not really happy about it, or
so that's the crazy part. It would seem that she was relatively happy with maybe not the gang rape leading up to it, but the fact that she was just accompanying her master to death or into Valhalla or whatever. So there's clearly some.
So she had the same belief system.
We can only speculate, and honestly, we don't even know 100% sure like where these so-called Vikings were from, or if they even were Vikings. They could have been from some part of Germany. They could have been from a Slavic country. They were alien to this guy, but he was an Arab merchant, right? And it's just one source,
right?
But I think of, like, to go back to the core of your question, how would a normal day in this age look? So I think we need to look at societal structure. I want to start there. So they didn't have like this complicated system with class and castes or anything like that, but they did have like a light version of that, sort of. So every area would have a chieftain. And it's not like the chieftain wasn't he wasn't like a king that could just judge everybody on the spot. People would pay tax to him once a year, probably tithe or tithe, I think it's called in English, which basically means in Danish tiende, which just means you pay 1/10 of whatever you have lying around in your in your, what's the word I'm looking for here? Fædebur.
Pantry?
In your pantry or whatever you had.
So they would be giving away grains or like a pig or something.
Right.
Like that.
It would depend on what you had, obviously. Okay. And this is before, during medieval times, people would organize, all the professionals would sort of organize in these societies, sort of, so all the blacksmiths would have their own society. They would meet up, and which is like eventually what led to the rise of unions, like a very early union. But this wasn't so.
Masons.
Or masons, exactly. That's a bit much better parallel, actually. So this is before that happened, but I'm getting a little sidetracked here. But the chieftain would be a normal person in the sense that his obligation to whoever paid taxes to him would be protection. So you could always go to the chieftain with any issue you had, and he and his men would then decide, okay, we rule in favor of this guy or the other, or the woman who says that this dude stole his or her cow or whatever, right? And if there were disputes that couldn't be solved here, or disputes between chieftains, local chieftains, once a year they would meet at a place called Tinge. We even still call it Folketing. That's like the parliament in Denmark, which means the people's court. I guess you could say that's what it means. But we have accounts that even back in the Bronze Age, which is thousands of years before the Viking Age, people would meet on these huge stones. We can guess as to why they would choose those locations, but every chieftain would go once a year, and everybody would go. If you didn't go, it's like, what's going on up?
You're not part of society.
You're not really part of society, and you would put yourself at risk, because they were like, okay, so maybe this guy, maybe he's dead, maybe we should go up and take over control in that area, become their chief, a neighboring chief could maybe get that idea, right, or something like that.
But they were farmers, right?
Like, that's the main, definitely.
So typically if they would go on the field and
right. So I'm sorry, I'm just trying to wrap this up. So we have the ruling class, sort of, but they're really just free people, and the main segment of society were just the free men and women, right? And they could do whatever they wanted to. Most of them were farmers.
Yeah.
Some, of course, were fishermen and women, obviously for obvious reasons, and of course Vikings are also known for their. They had a really, what at the time was a superior shipbuilding technology. So it was very obvious for them to use the sea as well.
So if they were farmers, were they also part of going to war and building ships, or was that separate? Was that other, like, different people?
No, that so it's hard to tell 100% for sure, but from all the remains, the physical remains, it all points to it were really normal people that went to war. So the chieftain would maybe send his men out and ask everyone in the area, we're going on a raid here this July, would you care to come? We don't know if that was a question as much as or it could have been just a command, you're going, right? But it would be a seasonal thing, clearly.
And then they would bring home slaves and divide them between the families, possibly?
Yeah, probably. There's an old saying among Danish kings, this is like early medieval, but I'm pretty sure it's fair to assume that it applied back then, that after a battle or a war, the honor belongs to the king, but the spoils belong to the warriors. So I think it's very fair to assume that whatever spoils they managed to stockpile, bring home from various raids and stuff, they would probably share them more or less equally.
Yeah.
And so we should say that, so there's this whole subclass of people that are slaves. But it should be said that these slaves were actually, typically, they would get a 10-year contract. It was non-negotiable. It's not like they would say, no, can I get an 8-year contract? But they would actually be able to sort of save up credits, or at least like moral credits, or goodwill credits maybe rather. And once that time had passed, they would join the class of free folks.
Could they return to their?
They could do whatever they wanted
original
to. I think that's part of the attraction. Why the Viking era has such a broad attraction is there's really, for anyone with a libertarian inclination, there's sort of a little bit of that in this culture, right? If you belong to this free segment of society, which is really the vast majority of everybody in this society. You could really do whatever you want. You can move wherever you want. There might be a new chieftain there, maybe not, and you would have to pay taxes to.
And what about the women?
So women are often said to have, and this compared to other contemporary societies, probably much more power than in most other cultural spheres, and we know this because we know that women could inherit. If their husbands died, and they would even sometimes, if there was a king and a queen and the king died, it didn't mean that everything is lost. The queen would take over, and also we see in mythology there are more obviously, the men on the battlefield in the descriptions we have are men, but we do have, for instance, the Valkyries, which are these strictly female warriors that fly in, swoop in, and pick up the fallen warriors on the battlefield.
Okay. And then what were they would grow different types of grains and vegetables in the summer?
They would definitely grow, so this is before the potato came to Europe.
Right.
So, of course, we can look at the remains of, sometimes we find corpses that are very well preserved because so Denmark is, first of all, a place with a lot of water, a lot of small islands. There's also a lot of moors and bogs and that kind of terrain, and that's actually really good for conserving. There's like a whole chemical explanation to that. There's no reason to get into that, but we can actually see in some cases the contents of some of these people's stomach. So they would eat a lot of porridge-like things, and they would eat a lot of root vegetables. Turnips was a huge thing, and various sorts of turnips, and beets as well. But they would also grow hemp, not necessarily for smoking, although there is some archaeological evidence that it would be used to get high as well. But they would
eat it, or
no, there's actually, I believe it's from a Swedish town called Birka or Birka, I guess. No, that sounds weird. Birka. Birka.
Okay.
Which probably means like the birch tree place or something like that. But there would be a huge trade settlement there. So this is in Sweden, but it's right across the pond from there. But they would find, I think they found the remains of like a hut that kind of, first they thought it was like, was it a sauna or something? But then they would actually find like huge amounts of burnt hemp. So it could have been a little hut that people would enter, and they would just throw plants on the fireplace in the middle, and everybody would go there and get high, basically, which is really mind-blowing to think about. Stoned Vikings,
like a sweat lodge.
So, we can speculate that could have been part of the deal, or but
we know saunas were very popular in Finland.
Very popular. They definitely used that as well.
Also in Denmark.
Oh, I'm sure they did.
All of Scandinavia.
Yeah, I think so, because it's huge in Germany as well, even to this day. So.
Okay.
But. Oh yeah, so hemp. Back to hemp. The reason they grew it was really, for weaving clothes of the sails on their sailboats. As far as I remember, most of their clothes was made of wool and hemp, but hemp was the big one. You can also make some very powerful, I believe even today, all the ropes that are used in the whole maritime world, they're all made from hemp. It's very strong material.
Is that warm enough for Scandinavia?
I mean, you'd have to pair it with something else, probably.
Yeah.
Wear multiple layers.
Leather.
And stuff. Leather, definitely. Yeah. But a surprising fact: almost no one wore pants, as far as we know. They haven't found that much cloth or fabric.
So did they wear long skirts?
They would wear,
to stay warm.
So there's obviously some difference between the male and the female clothing at the time, but most people would wear. They're actually they're called hosa, which is definitely the same word as a hose.
Sorry, guys, we have a wind going here.
As in a fire hose, and they would basically be a hose that you pulled up on each leg, but there would be no upper part to it.
Okay.
So it's like very long stockings, I guess. Super warm and wool. They are indeed very, very warm.
Okay.
So wear that, stuff like that.
So they kept cattle?
They kept cattle, absolutely. Actually, a fun anecdote. So the ancient Norse word for a cow is fe. We even still use in Danish today. It means moron, right? Stupid person.
Yeah.
But it is actually the same word as the English word fee, and it simply just means something of value, money,
Okay.
basically.
Yeah.
So when next time your attorney wants his fee, you can. That actually meant cattle in ancient Norse, but it's true. It's absolutely true. So that would be like the standard measure of wealth. Like how
Okay.
many cows do you have?
So they had cows and pigs and chickens.
Chickens and goats as well.
Goats and
Sheep,
sheep.
right?
And they would go fishing as well.
They would go fishing, yeah.
Hunting.
And hunting,
Yeah.
But again, this is we've already been an agricultural civilization for about 4,000 years at this point,
Okay.
or longer actually. So that's clearly the main thing.
Right.
But we do see, we could get into that. There are some remnants, I guess you could call it, of pagan life even today. And one of the big ones is Yule, or Yule, as we pronounce it, which is the Christmas party once a year. And so these days, as you point out, like to point out, people doesn't necessarily eat pork, but the traditional, like if you're really having a feast in Scandinavia, there's going to be a roast pork there, right? So that would be like a...
Yeah. Pork or duck for you.
Or duck, right, yeah.
So now we know a little bit about how they were living day to day. They were either out on the fields or tending to the house or the cattle or sewing clothes or you know, fishing,
right.
that
Crops
sort
that would
of
eventually come, right.
So what about their belief system?
Right. Okay. So I just want to attach one thing, because this is the climate in Scandinavia. It's very lush and the ground is very fertile, but we have a long, dark winter there.
Mm.
And even though the average temperature was like 1.5 degree higher back then, there's a long period that you need to get through where you cannot go and collect anything from your yard, or you maybe a frozen apple or something like that, but you can't grow anything, nothing. So I think like the mission during the summer, right? The mission is really just piling up as much food as you possibly can and as many animals as you possibly can to make it through the winter.
Right.
I just wanted to get through that. But it's actually a good segue into the belief system, because we have, obviously, I think most people know this probably, we have a gallery of gods, right? There are two overall families of gods, the Aesir and the Vanir. But all in all, you would have these gods, and every god would have at least one aspect. And Freya is a nice, a good example, easy to understand, right? She's the goddess of love, is often said, but also of just fertility, right? Mm. And I don't know if you want to...
Fertility, spring, magic. Spring,
right.
Yeah, creativity.
Right. And so the male counterpart is Frey, and I actually know there are accounts from as late as the 1850s. So this is Gotland not Scotland, but Gotland, which is also technically in Sweden, but it's an island, but sort of not too far from Denmark. But where as late as the 1850s, farmers would carry a wooden idol, carved idol of Frey, onto their fields and around in their fields in the springtime for a good harvest. Mm. So that just gives us a little bit of a clue as to the way this was used. I think it's fair to say that there's been a more practical angle to god worship. We also know this from, so the runes were used as magic symbols just as much as they were used for practical purposes. There's a sword found, I believe this is...
For those who don't know, what are runes?
So runes are, well, they kind of look like the letters we use in the alphabet right now, but we shouldn't really call it the runic alphabet. It's called the Futhark, which is named after the first 7 letters in the runic alphabet. There are actually 3 families of the runic alphabet. Let me see if I can remember this. So Freyr's family, and Hagal's family. I don't remember the last one. I'm not gonna remember it, I think. But there are these families, but that's a whole talk on its own. I remember we could do a separate episode on that, or you could, or something like that. But they would have magical properties, and each rune, it is. So let's just take the first one. It is called Fehu, and we already know that word because it means cattle or fee, right, cattle. Right. But it would wealth, yeah. Exactly. So the rune itself would be an F sound, but it would also have a meaning of its own. And there's a whole mythology around how all the pains that Odin went through to acquire the runes. And there's also, I believe, there's some myth about him, like sort of like dropping them by accident, which is how they made it to Midgard, where humans live. So
tell us about Odin. Who is he? So
Odin is the king of the gods, as most people probably know. But his aspect is wisdom, and he would really go, according to myth, he would go to great lengths to acquire wisdom. He would give his one eye to just get one sip of the well of wisdom. Which is obviously probably a pretty cool thing to... he would have 2 ravens. They would fly out and see the world, collect information, fly back and whisper in his ear what they saw. He's said to be all-knowing, all-seeing, but not in the like almighty Christian God sense of the word, more as in he's capable of... What if he wants to? He's capable of doing this. But he's a really weird and interesting figure. He's always been my favorite god by far. So there are a lot of stories and myths about him going undercover. So he's like, we don't really know why, but he disguises himself and he goes undercover and he goes and seek out. He just knocks the door at some human family and who's there? Oh, I'm just a traveler, and he uses different names. There's some scientist or some historian collected like all the names that he has, that's recorded as Odin has used all these names. Because I think it's like 200 different names, right? Which is really weird and interesting. But it seems that he does it. There's this tale, I don't remember, I think it's written down by one of the Icelandic saga authors as well, where he goes and visits first a king somewhere, but he's undercover and he sleeps with the king's wife and stuff like that. Then he goes and just a normal free family, and the same thing happens. Then he goes to the thralls and the slaves, right, and does the same thing. But it's all, and we don't really understand why, but it's all, the only thing that's clear is it's all in the pursuit of wisdom. And it is kind of interesting because there are more slightly more modern stories where we hear of these, so the king, he's like, he wants to know what's the people really saying about me, right, when they don't know I'm here, so he disguises himself and walks in the streets stuff. There's like a leftover of that, but we can kind of understand like why that would be a way to acquire wisdom. But I think it's also a very cool hint, sort of, that this would have been, this was probably an ideal at the time, right? And I still remember, I think I told you this before, I still remember I ran into this, well, I didn't consider them a young couple at the time. They were probably like 30 or something like that. I ran into them once back in Odense, our hometown, which is obviously named after Odin, ironically, but they were from Iceland, and we started a conversation. I was like, so you guys live here? And I remember the guy, he was like, for now, I can't do I would do an impersonation of an Icelandic accent, but that's too tricky. For now, but what we do, we Icelanders do, we travel out, find the wisdom and the wealth, and then we bring it back home, and then we stay there. I couldn't help thinking, this is like 16 years ago, right? It's not that long ago, but I couldn't help thinking, this is sort of a leftover of this way of thinking.
Right. And it's interesting that Odin was seeking knowledge.
Odin! I'm sorry.
and
Right.
this was something to strive for. But then in the Christian religion that came after, striving knowledge was bad. Humans were banned from paradise when they ate the apple that gave them knowledge.
Right. But, well, yeah, I agree that's a profound difference between the two belief systems. However, it should be said that we don't know what happened to someone in the Viking Age that said, "Oh, Odin isn't real," right? It could have led to a bad ending. I mean, I don't know,
True.
but yeah.
Do you think Odin inspired the character in Lord of the Rings? What's his name?
Gandalf?
Gandalf, yeah.
I would think so. I know it's common knowledge that Tolkien was very inspired by Norse mythology, and many of the names there, specifically the elf names, I guess. Eldon? Is that what it is? Okay. Especially the Eldar names are very... and many of them are just borrowed directly from Norse mythology.
Right. So in the last episode where I talked about my journey to Nordic shamanism,
Right.
I mentioned that I was born in Odense, and I said that it means the Odin's... Did I say Odin's city or
I think something like that.
something like that? And you told me that's not exactly correct.
It's obviously it's named after Odin, but there are two theories on it. But
Okay.
this is of course something like linguists are like, they write theses and this kind of stuff. But if we look at the word and we can look at medieval writings where it starts appearing, it was called Odin's Ve, which probably means something along the lines of for the glory of Odin, or Ve means it is still
given to Odin.
Yeah, given to a V. Oh man, I know there's an English word that's sort of related to that, but I just can't. Oh yeah, wedding. It's actually the same root as the beginning of wedding. So wed, it's sort of like given to, or sanctified to, or something like that.
Right.
Right. Or the other explanation, but I'm actually in favor of that explanation. But the other explanation is because there's a fjord. Yeah, a small fjord is called V in Danish too. So that's the other option. And there it is settled right at the end of such a fjord.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Well, tell us a little bit more about the other gods.
The other gods.
And how they relate to each other.
Right.
Order?
We haven't even gotten into the whole... So there's Yggdrasil, which is an ash tree, the tree of life. We don't know exactly where it is, but it is the tree on which all life grows. But we don't really know like how tangible that was understood. But what we know is there are 3 worlds in this worldview. There's Asgard, where the gods live. And there's Midgard, where the animals and the humans live, and then there's Utgard or Outgard, and yeah. So that is like the place of the giants, and we've talked about actually how to best translate this world. Jætter is what they're called in Danish, and it's like a mixture between a troll and a giant, or sometimes one, sometimes the other. But it's like a class of beings that's on their own, and they're up to no good. Trust me. They're always plotting and scheming to further some self-interest, and it's never a good thing for the gods nor the humans. And sometimes the gods are like they have counsel, like, oh damn it, we have this giant is planning on doing some crazy thing and we have to go stop him, and so there's this constant war going on between the gods and some of these giants are, well, I think all of them are like they're kind of stupid, but they also have supernatural abilities. Clearly, some of them, they have like their own chieftains. They're not like all described as, some of them are just, it's just a boring giant over there. But this guy, right, and Udgård's Loki is a guy. One guy, Utgard's Loki, not to be mistaken for Loki, who is a god who lives with the actual gods, with the Aesir gods.
But he also has giant blood.
Yeah, I think he's half giant as far as I remember.
And half god.
Right? But he I think that's actually like you might even speculate, does that make him human, right? Because he's sort of in between. He's kind of a trickster character, right?
Yeah.
He's like he's always lying, but at the same time he always volunteers. Oh, someone needs to go take care of this. Okay, I can do that. And the gods are like, oh, that's great. Oh, Loki is a great guy after all.
They always trust him.
They always trust him. But it's true. But it's obvious, right? He volunteers to do the thing that no one wants to do, right? So you have to pay a price for that, I guess. But this is the worldview, right? We have these three worlds. And
are they? Is Midgard below where the gods live, or how does it look?
I think so. It's a bit unclear, but there's also an underworld, but that's not the place where the giants live. In this worldview, that's actually called Hell with one L, and it's named after the goddess of death, and her name is Hel. Surprise. And so that's below. And
Hell is not a bad place?
No, it's a super bad place. Oh. You don't want to go there. It's nothing like the Christian hell. I've known some scholars have actually noted that it's, to some degree, it seems like it's almost the opposite. But they have one thing in common, that it's a true nightmare to be there. There's one account from, I believe it is Baldur who goes there in effort to save the love of his life.
Who's another god?
Who's another god, and he's in love with the goddess. And actually, Loki, I believe somehow, isn't it true? I think Loki somehow. Oh yeah, Baldur is blind, and he's throwing. They're throwing arrows, right? They have a little archery fun, and Loki can't help himself, so he makes Baldur shoot this woman that he loves, or something along those lines. No, he makes someone else shoot him. I don't remember the specific details, but he has to go through hell, literally. So Hel agrees to save her, but only if he manages to make every single human being in the entire universe shed a tear on her behalf. And everybody does it. The birds, the toads, all the humans, except for one.
Who?
I don't remember.
Oh.
You can Google it and look it up, and you should. It's so beautiful. It's heartbreaking, right? It's so you go through hell literally to make the impossible happen, and you do it.
Yeah.
Except for one, right? Except for one out of billions. Right, but okay, so there's a depiction of hell. That's actually what I wanted to get through. And so turns out you come to hell, there's actually a nice bed there. And obviously you're tired, right? Because you traveled a long way to get there through the underground tunnels and stuff. But the problem with this bed is, it looks nice and cozy and warm, that as soon as the more you sleep in this bed, the more tired you get. So maybe you're hungry too, right? There's a loaf of bread there and a knife, but the problem is that this particular loaf of bread and this particular loaf of knife is made in such a way that the more you eat, the more hungry you become, right? and that's how this hell works. And it's dark and dim and damp, and it's just
it sounds like a nightmare.
It totally is a nightmare.
Yeah.
But of course, you could kind of circumvent it a little bit if you know about that. You can not sleep in the bed, right?
Yeah.
Don't eat the bread.
So there's the underworld at the bottom, and then there's the Midgard in the middle, and then Udgård or Outgard around. And then we don't know if the gods' realm is above or...
I mean, it's clearly above Midgard. Mm-hmm. But you're right, there's definitely some stuff to be figured out still there, because...
And you don't know where the tree is in the middle of the world, right?
I think the tree is the world.
The tree is the world.
That's okay. At least, I think that's a plausible explanation.
Yeah.
But where these things are located in relation to each other, that's open for debate, you know. And it may not have been something that was of terrible interest to the people back then. I mean, it could have been, but...
Right. So we got Loki and Odin and Freya and Frey.
Right.
Some other gods that are interested you want to mention?
So Thor is obviously has become well known in the mainstream after the Marvel movies and stuff, but he was a very popular god as well.
And what does he symbolize?
Strength and war, but I want to say probably not all war. If we're talking strategic war, then Tyr would be your guy, or Odin. Thor is more he's typically in the myths and the stories we have still he's more like a brute strength kind of guy, and he's like, oh, we'll just go and kill them if there's some problem, right? But the other guy's like, no, right?
Like
we need a strategy,
raw power,
right? Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this leads us back to the runes actually. So there's the T rune, if you will. It's actually called Tyr.
After the god Tyr.
After the god Tyr. And there's also a very plausible, in my mind, theory that there's an even older god, predates the Viking Age by many, many hundreds, if not thousands of years, called Tivas. He was idolized and prayed to during on the entire what is Western Europe, like the entire Germany, France, those countries.
The north of Europe?
Probably also, but he's known to have been a god in those regions. So there's a theory that this guy, he made it into this gallery of the new gods, so to speak, or whenever. I mean, we can get into that, right? But there, I know there's someone found a sword, I believe, and there's like a tiny little. The T rune is carved into the hilt of the sword, Tivas, right? So obviously this is the god of strategic war, so it kind of makes sense to carve that into your sword. And I think there were also like, I think it was just the word Seiðr, which kind of reminds of the Danish word, modern word Seiðr, which means victory. So that's just, again, to give an idea of how the runes were used. You want to get a little more into the runes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
So what we have. So obviously there's like a sampling bias, the stuff that made it to now, the stuff that we can study today, right? That's all rock and metal, more or less. Not only
runes carved into
these materials, right? And so it's very tempting to just speculate that that's all they were used for, right? But we know they didn't use paper, so that's out of the question. But we also know that sometimes they would just carve stuff into little pieces of wood and stuff, and that's obviously lost, right? But again, referring to that Swedish town Birka, I know I believe they've actually found thousands of little of different use of runes. Because traditionally in Denmark, for instance, we have, I don't remember exactly how many. I think we have like 400 or 500 rune stones, maybe. And they are, almost all of them are like a stone, kind of like a tombstone, really. So they're risen by someone, for someone. And they always say who wrote the runes. Actually, wrote is actually reste. It was the same word, same old Danish word that we use, but which actually means carve. So yeah, or at least in ancient Norse. So and they always say, I think I remember one of them. It's just Östrither risti steintansi aftaraldur tansi magi or something, which just means I don't know. This I heard someone pronounce it in Icelandic.
I didn't know you spoke Nordic.
I don't really, but it just means Astrid rose this
Old Norse.
Rose this stone after her late husband Harold, and then it says, this guy carved the runes.
Do you think that was a volva?
No, I think, and I know that was an earl.
Okay.
But it could probably be speculated that that could very well be a male counterpart to a volva.
Right, they could be male or female.
Right, but as you pointed out in your first episode, as far as I remember, they typically were women. Right.
Yeah.
But so just as they typically were women, I would say this is like a specific class of people, a very small little niche, very unique position you could have. You could be an earl. I'm calling it earl. We would call it jarl. But it is what later became the modern day nobleman title. But it turned into that during the medieval period, because I guess Scandinavians left it in England, and those were typically powerful people, so they would become part of the noble class later in history. But it's like a specific class of people, and they would deal with rune magic. They would also deal with knowledge, and they would actually strive to live by Odin's ideal, more or less. And they would also carve the runes, and it's always, like, at least with the rune stones. So rune stones are risen over, like the dead person that it honors, that could be a male or a female.
Mm-hmm.
The person who orders the job to get done, that could be male and female. But the person carving the runes is always male.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm at least these types of runic inscriptions. Because they always say who wrote
And these
the runes.
are late? Are they all from the Viking Age?
They are pretty much the first ones are from the Iron Age, which is right before the Viking Age. But that's really just a classification we created today, right? They wouldn't say oh, my grandfather, he lived in the Iron Age, right?
Right.
So in Birka, for instance, they found, I believe, thousands of like little runic inscriptions. This is late Viking Age. They would actually start using them for like practical purposes, sort of like we've seen with the ancient Sumerians. They would have like they took them a long time to decode that, but I think these days they know, like, oh, this was actually it just says, it's a little sign that says this guy owes this guy 50 fish or 2 kilos of corn, or not corn, but you know what I mean, grains or whatever. Yeah. So they were used for that, and there's like one. It was like the best, the most ironic, humorous example from history ever. It's like, so they found the remains of an old inn, right around your 1000, right? An old inn, and I think it burnt down. And that actually preserves some of these things better. They burn and then that's a different story. But so they found this one stick, and apparently someone was sitting in this tavern or this inn, and his wife would send him a little letter, quote unquote, or a little runic inscription. And as far as I remember, it says, "Greta says, go home." And then that's funny, right? That's funny in and of its own. But the real fun starts with, so on the other side of this, someone seemingly tried to write an answer but failed miserably. So there's just these complete nonsense runes. No, I'm right. And I think it starts with a name, but there's a typo in it. But we can recognize the name, but the rest is just nonsense. So the theory is, of course, this poor fellow tried to answer Greta that I'm not
The
coming home right
bartender.
now. I don't know if this coincides with
Or the hostess of the inn.
I guess it could be the hostess, but the scholars I read were like they figured someone they lived out of town and she sent some messenger in like go give Harold this right now,
okay.
you know. But I guess you could be
I was thinking it was the hostess or the
because
bartender saying, "Okay, dude, you know it's time to go home.
Right. He's
I'm not
hearing
serving
me.
you any more beers."
That's plausible too, but I'm just. It's such
Could
a.
be his wife, yes.
Could be his wife. I'm just like when you start speculating. So was this the night that the inn burned down? That would make it pretty sad, right?
Yeah. Wow.
It's fantastic, right? So, but the point I wanted to get across that throughout approaching the end of the Viking era, we do see a more common use of the runes, and there's also a shift. We talk about the elder Futhark and the younger Futhark. They're two different. It's kind of like looking at Gothic letters, for instance. If you try really hard, you can kind of read them, right? They're the same letters essentially. They look different. That's pretty much the same with these two versions of the runic alphabet. And initially, some of them, when Denmark was christened officially in 1050, more or less, they would start building monasteries and stuff. And initially, some of the Danish monks, they would actually write in runes.
In their own books?
Yes, in their own books. So
I wonder why.
Because that's what they could. That's what they knew, right?
They were taught.
If they were taught, so they were obviously taught Latin and stuff, but some stuff like everyday stuff, you wouldn't write that in Latin, for bookkeeping of the monastery or stuff like that.
Oh, okay.
Only if you write stuff that's for someone else's eyes, obviously we write in Latin, right? But if it's just administration or your own stuff, and I think they did it they did it way into the medieval period for maybe until 1200 or something like that.
Do we know how common it was to know how to write runes?
So that's a good question. My guess would be, based on these anecdotes, I would say initially very uncommon, extremely uncommon. Only like these magician-like earls probably would know. We can speculate that völvas would too, maybe. But later on, I would say, I would imagine that most households that lived in heavily populated areas, at least, or in towns, most households would have someone capable of that, probably. Because it would just be super impractical not to. That's my best guess. No one knows the definite answer to that.
And how do we know that they were used for magic?
So we know from the inscriptions we find on weaponry, and we also have a few inscriptions with like a curse on it, and there's even an expression. There's one more source, we'll get into that in a second, but there's an expression that you cast runes after someone.
Okay.
You can even still say that today, right? So you would throw this little staff. Staff means it's like it's a branch or a little stick. A stick is maybe a better translation. That's what it means in Danish. And there's even an expression which is falde I staver, to fall into staffs, right? And I know there's some controversy around the interpretation of this, but I think a very fair way of understanding is that you fall victim to someone casting runes at you.
Yeah, you're hypnotized.
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah.
Right.
In a trance.
You're in a trance. And that's a good segue into the other way that we know it. We know it mainly because of folklore, of tales, but also from songs that have been preserved. And they typically, there's one called the Stig's runer, which means Sir Stig's runes. Not Stig's runes, that sounds weird, right? Right. But and it's basically about we can see they're clearly used for all sorts of purposes, but there's typically an element of So you use them to gain something, right? To win a war, win a battle, or win someone over who's not in love with you, that you're in love with, or that you desire, or something like that. But in these songs, and of course the songs were like, they were the fiction back then, right? So they might like add a little more to it than there really is. But it typically ends with a tragedy of some sort, like someone throws runes at, like, oh, I need this woman to be in love with me, right? But then something happens and he hits the wrong woman, right? And this woman hates him, and the other woman is, and they all die tragically, of course, and stuff like that. But yeah.
Do you think that this is a little bit of a Christian viewpoint? Maybe.
It totally could have been, because obviously when we turned to Christian society, or rather when, so first of all, the we went from having all these little chieftains, and we still did, but there was one king who pretty much just announced himself, I'm king of the entire country. This is now a country, and I'm now the king of it. And Denmark, and we're now Christians.
Which was also part of Norway was part of Denmark at the time, right?
I'm actually not sure it was yet.
Okay.
I don't think it was. I think that happened later.
Okay.
Don't quote me on it, but But it's the same cultural sphere, regardless of what the answer is. No, I think there was another king in Norway actually at the time. But who did the same thing, more or less, a little later. But and people would be told, now you're Christians. According to history, King Harold Bluetooth, the guy after whom the Bluetooth headset is named, allegedly. So he would send his soldiers around and go visit all chieftains in the country at this time. And we asked them, so are you with us or against us, more or less? Like, are you guys Christians now? And if they said no, they would just all be slaughtered, and he would take their possessions. And some of the Norwegian chieftains, they didn't want to do this, and they knew they couldn't win the battle, so they left for Iceland, and that's actually how Iceland was populated by Scandinavians.
Right. And how can we see on weapons that they were using magic?
Well, so admittedly that it's speculations, but we know there are many tales of magic swords. Tyrfing is a Thyrfing, I guess, in English. There's a great metal band called Thyrfing too. I love them, actually. Very old. But so that's a magic sword, right? And so there are some descriptions of like magic symbols, runes, basically being carved into weapons. But we also find the weapons. It would typically just very simple, grant me victory, or just victory, or maybe just one rune that symbolizes something that makes sense in the context in which it's found.
Okay.
Right.
And any other gods that you want to talk about?
There are many, many gods, and I guess I've always tried to not focus on, there's the getting a fascination with this period, right? That's something that can happen to a person, as it happened to me and in you as well, but probably many of the listeners, I imagine. And then there's I was in my late teens, I guess, when I became really obsessed with this, or not, my mid-teens, I guess. But I became aware that I don't want to just memorize all these facts so I can show off to my friend with it. That was never my intention with it. So I've actually probably just spent more time like meditating on not literally, but meditating on Odin and like reading about him than actually trying to remember all the other gods. There are many, many gods and demigods as well, and some of the gods have. So Thor, for instance, has a wife called Frigg, right? And
no, that's Odin's wife.
I'm sorry, Sig, right? Yeah. Sif, thank you. It's not Sig, yeah. Sif with the golden hair, right? Mm. And we know a little bit about her because she has long golden hair, and there's a giant that comes and try to steal it in one story, and but we don't really know
we don't know what she's a goddess of.
No, but people,
but she was a good woman, it seems.
I mean, she made it into history or somehow, right? So,
Yeah.
but she I mean, all these like sub gods and their family members, they could have all been subject to worship, I guess, but we just don't know these days.
Was Thor also a farmer?
Thor was definitely not a farmer. No.
Okay.
I mean, there would be a small group of people that were really just specialized warriors. The chieftain would have a herd, which is actually the same name. I think that's even where it comes from, which is I guess it's like an entourage almost, but it's a group of people, and of course they have their own households and stuff. But this specific group of people, all they do is really just like keep an eye out, like where are the enemies, what are we planning on doing, are we safe right now, what do we do if there's a war? They're really just preparing for war. And we should, we haven't even stressed that enough, I think. It's very much a warrior culture, right?
Yeah.
People were told, if you die on the battlefield, you go to Valhalla.
And what's Valhalla? So that's not hell.
That's not hell. This is the place you want to go. Valhalla. So if
it's like heaven, or
it is it's literally in heaven, but it's not very much like the Christian heaven at all. So it's a place for warriors specifically, and what you do is you get up each day and you go to Valhalla, which is actually a battlefield. And each night, when the last man is slain, first of all, you're picked up on the battlefield by a Valkyrie that brings you to Valhalla. But so you fight all day long because that's what you love, right? And once you fall, and the day is over, you get to go to Odin's golden hall with golden shields on the building, or as a roof on this building, and you get to eat. Oh, I never can remember the name of that pig, but there's like a. Is it Audhumla? No, that's.
I don't know.
No, that's from the creation myth.
So it's a pork that's always.
Yeah, it's a huge pig, and it's slaughtered every night, and every morning it's revived and comes back to life.
And the same with the warriors.
And the same, and they eat it every night, and they fight in the day, and they
party at
they
night.
basically party, yeah, and eat.
And in a time where Christianity was coming in and trying to take over the North, where war was so essential to keeping the culture alive, it's very smart to have this story that you're gonna go to a wonderful place with fighting and party if you go fight in the war.
I mean, it's I can't help thinking about like these recruiters that visit U.S. campuses and stuff like that, and they're like, oh yeah, they don't tell you you'll go to Valhalla, but you get a free college education. And did you know Tupac? He joined the Navy.
Yes.
But it's
military propaganda.
It kind of reeks a little bit of that, right? Yeah. But so again, we talked about this before. I wouldn't feel that this was a good podcast episode if we didn't talk about the golden horns.
Right.
So the golden horns were found. So it's a completely literal phenomenon here. So it's two massive horns of gold. I think both of them are probably weigh there's a small one and a big one. I'm guessing like 5-10 pounds each or something like that, a couple kilos. They were found with 50 years in between in the 1800s. First one by a little peasant girl walking on a field in the southern part of Denmark, and the second one a little later, right? They were both studied by the scholars of the time, and obviously they were actually smart. They did a very detailed drawing of it, and they created some copies of it, which was a good thing because there was a goldsmith a little later who stole these horns and re-smelted them and sold them. I've actually been in the building where this guy lived and where he smelted the horns. It was almost unbearable, right? Yeah.
Why did he do that?
Just for money.
Money.
Yeah, but he completely missed the missed the point that if he could have probably sold them to a Russian Tsar or some German collector for 10 times the money he just got from the gold bullion value, right? So it's a huge tragedy. But the good thing is they managed to make copies of these gold horns, and there's beautiful copy actually in the National Museum in Copenhagen. If anyone ever comes by that, it's definitely worth checking out. But the really cool part is, so we find it is all these weird symbols, and it looks really odd. It's like a man with snakes as arms, and woman with animal legs, and some of it is like almost kind of like leads your imagination to ancient Egypt, but not quite. There's also just a lot of weirdness.
There are no runes on it.
There are.
Okay.
But there's only one short rune inscription, and it just says "Ik levagastir runi taive" or something like that. It just means my name is Legast. I made these runes. I wrote these runes. That's it.
These runes.
Yeah, I wrote these runes.
Okay.
So it's like a meta comment to the runes.
Okay, but he.
No, I'm sorry. No, it actually says Horni Tavido made these horns.
Okay.
So my name is Legast. I made these horns.
So he probably did the inscription.
Oh, he definitely did the
Yeah.
inscription, and you can date them. They're written with the older Futhark, so we know this at least before year 800.
Okay.
So and it could be, I think, common speculation is like year 500 or 600, and the speculation goes someone like this has like just producing these horns today would be it would be costly affair, right? Back then you'd have to be an extremely wealthy person, right, to just get, like, how do you even get a hold of 10 kilos of gold, right? Or
can you find gold in Denmark?
No, I don't think you can. I don't know where they would get it from. Probably get it from far south. I would say. I mean, you can extract it, but if you have they would have the technology to do that, because they did that with iron and stuff like that. But there is no gold in Denmark, as far as I know. At least nothing that's ever been extracted. So
what's the theory on these?
So the theory is that there. This is one theory, right? But it does seem very plausible that there was some religion, some belief system, and that this person saw this is disappearing. A new power is arising, to quote Saruman from Lord of the Rings, right? And someone went through great lengths to create these horns and conserve like the core of the ancient tradition, whatever it was, right? But it's so frustrating, because many attempts have been made to try and interpret, because the symbols on the horns, you Google it, the gold horns, Denmark. That's probably all you need to Google. It looks as a mixture of letters and weird symbols. It just looks really weird. So you can't help thinking, this is something I could read if I only like had the key, or the knowledge. I should be able to break this, but no one has been able to do it so far. So there's really only one like valid observation that's been made, that if we look at Celtic culture, which was sort of contemporary. I guess it had mostly died out at this time, at least in its pure pre-Christian form, right? But the Celtic cultural sphere is actually pretty close to where these were found, right? Because it stretched all the way up to northern France, what is modern-day northern France, and also some parts of Germany, as far as I remember, and the English continent, of course. And there's really just, I don't know, there's probably just 100 miles or a couple 100 miles maybe from where that sphere starts and where this happens. So we could have been part of that. And if we look at some of these, we have some old Celtic cauldrons and stuff like that was also, at least in terms of style, pretty widespread in Denmark in the previous period, in the Iron Age leading up to the Viking Age. So at least some of this symbolism or iconography or whatever you want to call it seems to be related to these golden horns, but not quite though. So it's just a big mystery, and it's really fascinating. If anyone's looking for a rabbit hole to fall into out there, definitely recommend this one.
I'm gonna look into it.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
It's very interesting. I wanted just to quickly go back to when people died, because so the warriors would go to Valhalla. Where would all the other people go?
So we don't know. So
Okay.
the only stories we have left are that there would at least at one point, it seems at one point in time you would tell people, if you don't die, if you die the straw death, as they would call dying in your bed, because people would sleep on
straw.
on straw, right? The straw death. Oh no, not the straw death. No. But if you did that, you would go to hell. But I can't for the life of me imagine that that's what people really believed that back then. I don't think so. Perhaps even you kind of speculated with some of these myths and songs and ballads and stuff like that, that those could have been sort of hijacked and twisted a little bit, or maybe just perceived through a Christian lens later. Maybe that has happened a little bit with this part of mythology too.
Yeah.
Because I really don't see. Maybe I don't know. I guess it's possible that they just had a theory that said, well, when you die, you're gone. Because we actually don't have any.
Well, I don't think that would make sense, because we do know that in these shamanic traditions, it's very important to keep contact with the deceased ancestors,
right? And
you will work with them in your shamanic work.
Right, you're absolutely right. And I should say this, we completely forgot this. A huge part of culture, and I don't even know if I should call it the belief system or a culture, but a huge part of it is ancestor worship.
Yeah,
it's a major part of it, but it's not. I mean, yeah, just honoring your ancestors, perhaps even sacrificing to them,
knowing that they're watching you, helping you.
I mean, yeah, probably, and. But also like tracing it back. This is an oral tradition period, right? So they would have law say men, as they were called. It would really just be people who would just quote the entire law. This is something I need to get in there too. The oldest law in writing in Denmark is called Jyske Law of Jutland, which is like the mainland of Denmark. And as far as I remember, it's written down in 1150 or so. So 150 years after the end of the Viking Age. But it says so in the writing that this is the ancient landscape laws of Denmark. So it really, you can actually read this. I don't know if there's an English translation of it. There's probably excerpts, definitely translated. You can actually sit and read how the law of the land was almost 1,000 years, probably 1,000 years ago, because that was a very strong oral tradition, right?
Can you give a little overview?
I mean, I've tried to read it from start to finish, but it's really too boring. It's really just, it's very tangible. It's like if you have 5 sheep, and you have a stone fence marking the area where your sheep is grassing. Your neighbor cannot do this, and if he does trespass, and if his horse does this, you're entitled to this. And but the cool part is that the current grundlov, that it's actually more or less, it's the equivalent of the Constitution in the U.S. that's still in use, but the Danish it translates into like the basic law, right? That's from 1850 as far as I remember, but that's actually more or less identical to Jyske Law from the 1100s.
Wow.
So it could be said with some truth to it that most of the legal system in Denmark, even today, is based on the laws of the Viking era or the pre-Christian era.
Is it similar to the 10 Commandments?
No, not really. It's actually something that I would actually say it's more relatable than the 10 Commandments. It is younger too. I don't know. Maybe not. I'm sorry, not. But it's more relatable than the Old Testament. That's what I meant to say. It's not like if someone. It's not like there's no like chop that would chop off his hand or poke out his eye or anything like. But it's more like. It's actually more like some of the old Babylonian writing. What's it called? The Epic of Gilgamesh, I believe it's called. It's more like if someone does you an injustice, you pay him this much and that much, and also like how do you resolve a conflict? Who has the authority to solve stuff and stuff like that? But it's like a huge work. I should have read it actually, but. I should read it.
Maybe one day.
Guess I could create the audiobook, huh?
Yeah.
Well, I shouldn't say that. People will steal my idea now.
Oh.
Good luck, guys.
Yeah. Okay. So I wanted just to touch a little bit about on folklore.
Right.
We have these different stories that are still present in today's culture.
Right.
And we assume they're also left over from this old pre-Christian culture.
At least some of them, yeah.
Things like fairies and elves,
right.
luring you into the underworld.
Right.
And these little what are they called? The Christmas elves.
I guess we call them goblins in English, but Nissa, yeah. They're more like fairies or tiny elves, probably elves, I should say. Yeah, but they're like
They're like little tricksters, right?
Little tricksters, and we still like around Christmas. Everyone. So you call them crawling goblins, and you have a little paper version of them, so you could have like one here on a picture frame, and it kind of peeks out, and ready to make trouble, but they're not like, it's not like they're not gonna kill you in your sleep.
They're not evil. They're just
they maybe they hide your stuff. They take your keys, or
they like to tease.
They like to tease you, yeah.
So for Christmas, for Yule, we still have to give them some rice porridge,
right,
for Christmas, because otherwise they're gonna be trouble all year long.
Right.
So things like that is definitely left over from the pre-Christian culture.
Right.
And what about these creatures over lakes? What are they?
Over lakes.
Yeah, they're kind of like
floating over. I don't know. There are so many beings. There are some that are said to live in riverbeds and in lakes. The Lady of the Lake. There's sort of a little bit of that tradition from England as well originally.
The ones that don't have any backs.
Oh, right. So that would be elves. Elves. That's what the Scandinavian tradition.
They look like beautiful women, right?
Right.
Are they like sirens?
There are men too. Some of them are sort of like sirens. Yeah, but so they can live in lakes, or at lakes, maybe rather. They can also live on burial mounds. Denmark is a country that's completely plastered with burial mounds. Some of them have been removed by farmers. Mainly thousands of them have, but there are still thousands of them in the landscape. And and according to folklore, so let's say you've been working in the field or something, you're going home to town or home to your house, and you may encounter like a beautiful, glowing woman, or even sometimes a party of people, men and women. They're very very attractive. You're just mysteriously attracted to them. You want to go there.
They sing, right?
Some of them sing. Sometimes they just dance. Sometimes there's just a music coming out from the mount itself. You don't really know where it comes from. But if you ever experience that, don't go near them. Right? They'll pull you right into the barrow mount, and you'll be dancing there forever. You'll basically join their dance, and you'll be stuck dancing.
So they're forever. Mesmerizing and
right.
And hypnotizing, and then you end up in a bad place. Could that also be the Christian viewpoint that's kind of stuck?
I mean, it could have. We don't see the exact same figures. Or at least we don't have accounts of those exact same figures in pre-Christian time. But then, or maybe we do. I don't know. It seems like. I'm actually probably more inclined to say that those ideas would have probably been around before Christianity arrived at our doorstep. But it's clear to me, like reading even Brothers Grimm or maybe like a Danish equivalent of that. They're like, even if you do read Brothers Grimm, there's typically the Brothers Grimm version. But then there's like a Danish version that's almost the same. Maybe it takes place in a different town.
Because Brothers Grimm were collecting. The old folklore.
Right, and
stories.
And Germany is really just across the border, so some of them would overlap, right? But reading those stories, like sometimes they mention that so there's this evil troll living out here, and he made a pact with the devil, or he wanted to steal the church bell or something like that. But it kind of seems like but it's just the devil part has just been added, But the because we have another version of the same story where there's no mention of the devil, where it's not the church bell, but it's rather a barrel of fish or something else the troll wants to steal, right? So probably some of them have been, but.
Yeah, it's interesting because you also, if you look to the Arabic culture, where they also had these
genies,
spirits, they're also known to be tricksters.
Right. Right.
So it seems like it's this is something that you see in many cultures, and it's probably not all just because of a Christian viewpoint or a former religion's viewpoint. But it could be. It's hard to.
It's up for debate, I guess.
Yeah.
But I guess there's another element, because, like, there must have been certain elements of living in a country where from one day to the next, you're basically just told, "Oh, now we're Christians." I mean, obviously, a lot of people already were Christians, but definitely not the majority when it happened. That also means essentially that if you just keep talking about the same stuff, if you keep believing what you believe, you're probably going to get killed, or some bad stuff will happen to you. But there is a way that you can keep talking about it. You can keep talking about it, but you say, but those are the evil spirits, right? Or they're. But God is trying to like keep them in check or whatever. It could have been a means to sort of like for people to keep believing fundamentally what they already believed, that all these creatures were alive and all that stuff. But now they're just evil, right? They used to not be evil, but now we agree. Oh, they're like pretty bad, most of them, Or
yeah.
I guess that's another take on it.
Right. So, do you think that the way the devil is portrayed is some kind of leftover from earlier fertility cults, Iron Age fertility cults, where they did use the horns on their gods?
I think that's a valid speculation, but it strikes me as very valid. The horns and the hoofs, or it's the legs of a goat, right? Or at least a goat-like creature, and
right.
I think Pan, right, is a.
That's the Celtic god.
I was gonna say Greek, but is he Celtic? I guess he is Celtic.
I think so. Yeah.
Right. but okay, right. But I'm just. But again, it's hard to tell, right? Because is that because depictions of Pan in Christian times have borrowed the way he looked, or is it really because he sort of turned into a devil figure? I don't know, but yeah.
Well, obviously the Christians wanted to paint the old the pagan gods as the evil,
Right.
the evil gods,
Right.
the devil,
Right.
so that you would turn to Christianity.
Right.
Yeah.
But I know. I mean, it's a really weird and interesting development, because we haven't even talked about this, but there are some clear parallels between the old Norse gods and the Roman gods and the Greek gods. It's like if you look at them as aspects rather than gods with names,
Like archetypes.
sort of. Yeah, some of them are clearly more or less the same god. There's Zeus. He has his lightning. He throws lightning. Thor has a hammer, and he was set to create lightning. Lightning would be when he rode over the sky and hit with his hammer, right? It's pretty much the same thing, right? There's even, I actually did like etymological, what was it? It was some clever thing. Oh yeah, so let me see if I can remember this. So Tyr, right? The god of war. So he's typically depicted with a sword and a spear, right? But so Tyr, he would also be called Tivas, or in some regions, Divas. The S sound would be pronounced as an R. Divar, or Deus, or Divas, or you know what I mean? Tyr, Tivas, Divas, Deus. It means God. It simply just means God. So it could have been, archetype God kind of person,
Right.
or entity, I guess. But okay. So another thing worth noting is, so year 1000 in Europe, like all the other like the Roman Empire, the Roman mythology and the Greek mythology, they're gone at this time. They're all Christians now, right? But somehow the Teutonic tribes managed to hold off the Christians, but they just came further and further north. But they actually like kind of held them off for like a good more than 500 years almost, right?
Yeah.
So it's like the final bastion of that old religion. But at the same time, we know that before that there was another religion, right, or another belief system. It's really pretty mind blowing when you think of it.
Yeah. Do you feel like there are any other leftovers in today's culture and spirituality in the North from this old culture?
I mean, yes, I think most of them, or maybe these are just the ones I've noticed, but many seem to be conserved in language, actually. I mean, even just the weekdays in English, even they're pretty much the same as in Danish. But they're Thursday, that's Thor's day, right? And what else is there?
Friday.
Right, Friday. Yeah.
Freya's day.
Yeah, there you go. Right, and it's crazy, right?
Wednesday, Wotan's day, Odin's day.
There you go. Right.
And in Danish, it's onsdag, Odin's day.
Right. It's mind blowing.
Tirsdag. Tuesday, Tears Day,
or God Day.
Yeah.
Theory, right? So there's that, and of course, other leftovers. So there are some legal leftovers, definitely, but at the same time, whatever leftovers there are and have been, I don't know. I say this kind of with a heavy heart, but I really feel modern life, technology, we're so detached from the earth, and I'm not actually. There's something called the naturalistic fallacy, right, which says that just because something's natural, it's good. And I like to point out that so rape is good, right? Because that's, in theory, it's a natural thing, right? But so it doesn't mean that it's good just because it's natural. But at the same time, I can't help thinking that we're missing something that we used to possess.
When you say rape is natural, is that because you look at the animals and how they...
No, we could do that, but we could just look at the human past, right? Read the Bible. It's just a standard practice. It used to be completely normal, and even that court case is, I think it's from the 80s, like Texas. In the 80s, some woman was raped because she wore jeans. So the judge decided that, well, if you put it on yourself, young missy, you want to be raped since you're wearing jeans, right? That's the 1980s. You know what I mean? It's just an example. I could come up with other. I mean, everything that we find as soon as we leave the house, right? We can be said to be natural, but doesn't mean that I can eat animal feces, and that's natural too. But that doesn't mean it's good, right? You know what I mean? Just because it's something people used to kill each other all the time. So it's natural, obviously, to kill other people. So we should do that, or I don't know. I do know. I mean, yeah.
Well, I mean, if you look at nature, I don't think, if you look at animals, they don't kill just to kill. They kill for a purpose, and I think that...
Not all animals.
What do you mean?
Nina, our cat, she likes to play with animals, just play with them, right? But if we weren't around, she would definitely kill them without eating them.
Well, I think she would eat them if we didn't feed her cat food. So it's in her nature because she needs to feed herself.
Right. Well, yeah, I don't know. I see what you mean. So you what you're essentially saying is that cruelty seems to be a human trait.
Yeah.
I think I would agree with that.
Not necessarily natural.
Right, but that's another good argument actually. So you could say that just because people did something in the past doesn't mean that it's actually natural.
Right.
Necessarily.
Yeah.
It could be.
But in most cases, it's more natural than what we have going on today. In
many cases, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, it's Yeah, I think I told you, I've always been one of those people that if a genie showed up and granted me a wish, I was like, oh, yep, take me back to year 600, please. I'll be right. You know what I mean? I've never had any doubts of that. But I'm actually, I recently caved in and read Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature. He just goes through all, like, 200 pages just with violence and bloodbath and horrible, despicable behaviors of people of the past. And it's and I don't know why I never really recognized that. That's a good thing. We're not doing that anymore. Yeah.
Well, I don't know that we're not doing that anymore.
No, but to the same extent. It was so just an example, right, from medieval Europe, was like, apparently, like, a normal weekend piece of entertainment was like burning a cat slowly over a fireplace, just watching it and laughing. People would find that funny. It's torture, right? Yeah. And it was widespread. And people would go to public executions, public torture, all that kind of... It's a real thing,
that's
right?
Horrible.
It's horrible, right? So, but again, we don't know, and we can speculate. It's just something I naively sometimes like to think, yeah, but isn't that like part of the whole Christian Vatican power bastion, like doing this to scare people? And even there was like a power struggle between the European kings and the church, right? They were kind of like duking it out, sort of, but without going into a full-on open war. But I don't know. That's another podcast, maybe.
Well, yeah, it's interesting, but probably we got a little sidetracked.
that's on me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so take us back to the past.
Well, I just wanted to really finish up with that. If you could see any leftovers from these old spiritual practices in today's culture in the North.
It's a really hard question, because I mean, what do you mean? Do you have anything in mind? Let me hear your take on it.
Well, obviously, I'm thinking about just Nordic shamanism, which has had a bit of a revival with the with völves and Seid practice, but it's not mainstream in any way, and it's kind of a mixture of people looking back to the old sources and also mixing a little bit with Native American shamanism and things like that. So I don't see anything really in I feel like Buddhism is probably the most popular spiritual practice in Scandinavia at the moment, because most people who call themselves Christians there are not really Christians. They like to use the churches for weddings and events, but they don't really believe in the Bible. And I think most people who are into spirituality in the North are probably into yoga and mindfulness.
Right.
So a Buddhistic.
These days, that's absolutely true. Well, I guess that's because I wasn't sure when you asked the question if you meant, so does it have to be like an unbroken tradition? If that's what we want, I'd say most of it's gone. Yeah. Like almost 100%.
Yeah, probably the only one you could think of is the only so-called witch in Denmark.
Right, but she wasn't taught that by her mother.
Yeah, her grandmother.
Right, but her grandmother's mother wasn't a witch, and if she was, I bet her grandmother wasn't. You know what I mean? So there are these people, and I'm not saying, like, I have huge respect for all that. They talk to, they seek out as authentic and original information as they possibly can. I mean, that's what we do, right? That's what most people do who dive into these things. But the truly unbroken tradition, I'd say the only version of that we have is the Samic people, right?
Right.
They have like they still have this magician tradition, and it's unbroken. I'm sure it's unbroken. But in we got Western Scandinavia, right? Denmark, Norway, Sweden. No, actually, probably in Sweden, because they have like Samic people way to the north, maybe in Norway.
And in Norway as well.
Right. So they may have, but I'm not sure that those people are modernized these days.
They still use the shamanic traditions.
Okay, so there may be a little bit up there,
yeah.
But it should be noted that is not the same tradition. They would be, even for the people who lived in Scandinavia and took part in this whole Viking religion and society we just talked about, they would have looked at those people up there and thought, these are crazy people. They're like Indians. They are Indians essentially, or native Scandinavians is what they are really. So it's a different cultural sphere.
Right.
But they would have obviously met and somehow touched on each other. I don't know.
Well,
it's really hard.
The Seid tradition is very similar to the Sami spiritual tradition.
No, I think they used to be probably more or less the same thing.
Yeah. And just to touch on the so-called witch that we mentioned before, Dani Druhyl,
right,
which is the only when we were growing up, the only woman in Denmark who went public and said, "I'm a witch."
Right.
She has written books about the folklore in Denmark and the old ways of a wise woman. And she learned from her grandmother, and her grandmother learned from her. And so I think the tradition was passed down, but they might have been in hiding and not speaking about it openly for many, many centuries. But that is, as I recall, is what she said she learned from her grandmother, and I'm sure the grandmother learned from her.
I'm just saying, if beyond like the royal families of Europe, I don't really see any families maintaining the same tradition for 1,000 years these days. I mean, even people that are doctors, right? They always seem to come from families of doctors themselves, right? But it only goes back so far.
Right. Yeah. All right. Any last words in this podcast?
I mean, I felt like we touched on so much, but there's so much else we can talk about, and we tried to cover.
We can always do another episode.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And okay, so I'm gonna do it for you, but I'll just encourage any listeners that are like, oh, why didn't they drill down on this subtopic? Let us know, right? Or let you know. I'm not taking over your podcast yet.
Yeah, you can definitely email me or leave a voice message, and I'm gonna be linking to Asger's platforms, so you can check him out some more. And thank you so much for listening today.
If you'd like to support this podcast, consider becoming a Patreon on patreon.com/NordicMagicLink. You can donate as little as $3 a month. Patreon is a brilliant tool for independent artists of all kinds. Patreon supports artists and content creators like myself and gives us a way to connect more personally with our followers. It removes the fear of how much am I going to make this month, and allows artists like myself to take more chances with our art and content. Everyone who pledges will be rewarded with exclusive access to different levels of Nordic music magic. All the music you heard on this podcast was my own music, and you can go to emmacairo.com, and that's EMMACAIRO.com. If you like this podcast, please consider giving it a review or thumbs up. It really makes a difference on iTunes or any of the other platforms. And I hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you.